It was a rough 2 years just as far as the transition, learning the NBA game and learning how to be a pro.
Marquese Chriss, born July 2nd, 1997. Marquese Chriss was one of those NBA players where if you only remember the name and where he was drafted, you probably assume he lasted a lot longer than he actually did. Chriss was the 8th overall pick in 2016, an athletic 6'9" forward with ridiculous bounce, shot blocking ability, and enough potential that Phoenix traded up to get him. He was only 19 years old, started 75 games as a rookie, played all 82, and even made the all-rookie second team. At that point, nobody expected him to be fighting for his NBA career just a couple years later, but Chriss was always a project. This was a player who fouled out of 15 of his 34 games in his one season at Washington. That's 44% of his college games. And somehow, just months later, he was a top 10 NBA draft pick. That pretty much sums up the gamble teams were making on him. They weren't drafting the player Marquese Chriss already was. They were drafting the player they thought his athleticism could eventually turn him into. Unfortunately, the development never happened fast enough. By 22, he had bounced through Houston and Cleveland and was fighting just to prove he belonged in the league. Then, right when Golden State seemed to finally figure out how to use him, a major leg injury changed everything. Chriss had the talent, youth, and physical ability to become something in the NBA. The problem was, from the beginning, time was never really on his side. What happened? Let's talk about it. Salute to Samir Huck 1143 on YouTube for this request. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth. Let's get it, man. Like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know who I should do next. Marquese Chriss was a 6'9" forward from Sacramento, California, who was still relatively new to basketball compared to most players who eventually become NBA lottery picks. Growing up, football was actually his first sport, but after suffering a shoulder injury in 8th grade, his mother pushed him away from football and toward basketball. By the time he reached Pleasant Grove High School, Chriss was beginning to grow into the combination of size and athleticism that would eventually make NBA scouts fall in love with him. He wasn't considered some can't-miss superstar throughout high school either. Chriss was a 4-star recruit who committed to Washington, where his stock completely changed in one season. As a freshman in 2015-16, he averaged 13.7 points, 5.4 rebounds, and 1.6 blocks while shooting 53% from the field. His athleticism jumped off the screen. Chriss could run the floor, finish above the rim, block shots, and even showed enough touch away from the basket to make teams believe there was much more coming. But the rawness was just as obvious. Still, NBA teams were betting on upside. After 1 year at Washington, he entered the 2016 NBA draft and quickly climbed. Sacramento selected him 8th overall before immediately trading his rights to Phoenix, who specifically moved up to get him. At just 19 years old, Chriss was suddenly a lottery pick, entering the NBA with tremendous physical tools, but a basketball game that still had a lot of catching up to do. Stunt number 1, a game that was way too raw. Marquese Chriss was simply way too raw for where he was drafted, and I think that 44% foul out number from college tells you almost everything you need to know. Fouling out of 15 of 34 games at Washington wasn't just some weird statistic. It showed how far behind Chriss was when it came to positioning, timing, discipline, and impacting a game without relying on his athleticism. He averaged 4.1 fouls and only 24.9 minutes per game. But instead of those weaknesses keeping him in college another year, his physical potential pushed him all the way to the 8th pick. Phoenix wasn't drafting a finished basketball player. They were drafting an athlete they hoped they could teach how to become one. Initially, you could understand why. Chriss played all 82 games as a rookie, started 75, averaged 9.2 points and 4.2 rebounds, and made the all-rookie second team. There were nights where you could see exactly what Phoenix saw. He could fly down the floor, catch lobs, finish through traffic, and erase shots around the rim. He even showed flashes of a 3-point shot, making 72 threes over his first 2 seasons. But those flashes never developed into one reliable NBA skill. He wasn't a good enough shooter to stretch the floor consistently, wasn't a strong enough rebounder to control the paint, couldn't create offense for himself, and defensively, his athleticism couldn't always make up for mistakes in positioning and awareness. The fouling problem followed him too. Chriss averaged 3.2 fouls in just 21 minutes a game as a rookie and 3.3 in 21.2 minutes his second year. That's a difficult player to keep on the floor, especially when he isn't giving you elite production somewhere else. and this is where being drafted 8th overall worked against him. If Chriss were a late first round project, there would have been less pressure for immediate results. But lottery picks are expected to become building blocks. Phoenix already had Devin Booker emerging and eventually had to decide whether Chriss was actually a part of their future. After 2 seasons, their answer was basically no. They traded him to Houston before his 21st birthday. 2 years earlier, Phoenix had traded up because they believed Chriss would become something special. Now they were already moving on. His athletic ability got him into the NBA before his basketball development was ready for it, and once that lottery pick shine wore off, Chriss had very little time to figure everything out. Stunt number 2, yes, Phoenix failed him, but he certainly didn't help himself. As raw as Marquese Chriss was, Phoenix also wasn't exactly the ideal organization for a 19-year-old prospect who needed patience and development. During Chris's 2 seasons with the Suns, they won just 45 combined games, changed head coaches, shuffled young players around constantly, and were still trying to figure out what they were trying to build around Devin Booker. Earl Watson coached Chriss as a rookie, then was fired 3 games into his 2nd season and replaced by Jay Triano. For a young player still learning basic NBA defensive concepts and trying to establish a position, that lack of stability mattered. But Chriss didn't exactly make things easier on himself either. His 2nd season should have been the year that he took a noticeable step forward. Instead, his numbers barely moved. He went from 9.2 points and 4.2 rebounds as a rookie to 7.7 and 5.5, while his shooting dropped from 44.9% to 42.3%. His minutes stayed almost identical, and Phoenix still couldn't depend on him consistently. There were also questions surrounding his conditioning and maturity. Chriss later admitted that during his 2nd year, he wasn't paying enough attention to his diet and conditioning, saying the sudden combination of free time and money forced him to learn how to manage himself better and grow up in that area of his life. That's a major problem when you're already trying to catch up developmentally. Phoenix needed to teach Chriss how to become an NBA player, while Chriss was still learning what being an NBA professional even required. By the summer of 2018, the Suns had seen enough. They traded him and Brandon Knight to Houston for Ryan Anderson and DeAnthony Melton. Houston should have been a fresh start on a veteran team coming off 65 wins, but Chriss couldn't crack the rotation. He appeared in only 16 games, averaged 6.5 minutes, and Houston declined the 4th-year option on his rookie contract. By February, he was traded again, this time to Cleveland. That's when his career completely changed. Chriss was no longer being treated as a prize lottery prospect. In less than 3 years, he had gone from Phoenix trading up to draft him 8th overall to playing for his 3rd NBA organization. Phoenix absolutely deserves some responsibility for failing to provide the stability a project like Chriss needed, but Chriss also wasn't developed enough, consistent enough, or prepared enough to force teams to keep investing in him. And in the NBA, once that happens, opportunities disappear quickly. Stunt number 3, figured it out too late. By the time Marquese Chriss arrived in Golden State in 2019, the expectations that once followed the 8th overall pick were basically gone. He was 22 years old, joining his 4th NBA team in barely 3 years, and wasn't even guaranteed to make the Warriors roster. But strangely enough, this became the place where Chriss finally started looking like he understood what type of player he needed to be. Instead of trying to become the versatile star Phoenix originally envisioned, Golden State simplified his role. Run the floor, set screens, finish around the rim, rebound, protect the basket, and use that athleticism without forcing everything else. The results were easily the best basketball of his NBA career. Chriss averaged career highs of 9.3 points, 6.2 rebounds, and 1.1 block, while shooting over 54% from the field in 59 games. Golden State actually waived him midway through that season because of roster and hard cap complications, only to bring him back 8 days later on a 2-way contract and eventually give him a regular deal. Steve Kerr even admitted he was surprised another team hadn't claimed Chriss when they temporarily let him go. For the first time since Phoenix, it felt like an organization had found a legitimate place for him. He wasn't becoming the star people imagined in 2016, but at 23, there was still plenty of time for him to become a productive NBA big. Then, just 2 games into the following season, everything changed. During a December 2020 practice, Chriss fractured his right fibula and suffered an ankle injury that required surgery and ended his season. And for a former lottery pick who had already spent years trying to rebuild his value, losing basically an entire season couldn't have happened at a worse time. It basically spelled the end of teams viewing him as potential and not a risk. Golden State traded him to San Antonio while he was injured, San Antonio waived him days later, and Portland waived him before the next regular season even began. Dallas eventually gave him another opportunity through multiple 10-day contracts, and he played 34 games there, but only 10 minutes per night. That became his final NBA season. Chriss finally figured out how to survive in the NBA, but unfortunately, by the time he did, the injury took away the momentum he had spent years trying to build, and at just 24, he was done. All in all, Marquese Chriss is a perfect example of how being drafted on potential can put a player on a timeline he isn't ready for. Phoenix saw a 19-year-old 6'9" freak athlete with enough upside to imagine what he could eventually become, but the warning signs were there. This was a player who was extremely raw entering the draft. Once he reached the NBA, the athleticism translated, but the rest of his game never developed quickly enough to match where he was selected. Phoenix's instability didn't help, but Chriss also had areas where he needed to mature and improve himself. The unfortunate part is Golden State eventually showed that there was a useful NBA player there. Chriss stopped needing to justify being the 8th pick and started playing a role that actually fit him. At only 23, it looked like he had finally found some stability. Then, the fractured fibula and ankle injury came at the worst possible time. Chriss eventually returned with Dallas, but the momentum was gone. His career was always a race against development and expectations, and by the time he finally started catching up, the NBA had already begun moving on. Salute, much respect, but for these reasons, his growth was stunted. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth, and I'm out.